These were the wonky teeth that ultimately got Ted Bundy convicted. Before that moment, Bundy had already escaped custody twice in 1977 while awaiting trial in Colorado. During his first escape, he was allowed to act as his own attorney and therefore wasn't put in handcuffs, which gave him enough freedom to slip away from guards and jump from a courthouse window. After being recaptured, he engineered a second escape by deliberately starving himself, losing enough weight to squeeze through a small opening in the ceiling of his jail cell. That second escape took him all the way to Florida, where he apparently still couldn't resist his murderous urges. While hiding out in Tallahassee, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house and carried out a brutal attack on 4 young women, leaving 2 of them dead. One of the victims, 20-year-old Lisa Levy, was bitten deeply on the left butt cheek during the assault, leaving behind a clear dental impression. Unlike Bundy's earlier crimes, which were built largely on circumstantial evidence, the bite mark was matched to his unusually crooked teeth and served as the key piece of evidence that finally sealed his conviction as a serial killer. In 2020, Ohio College student Sidney Powell brutally murdered her mother Brenda Powell inside their home. Prosecutors say Sidney first struck her mother with a cast iron skillet before stabbing her more than 30 times in the neck. The attack happened while Brenda was on the phone with officials from the University of Mount Union, who were speaking with her about Sidney being dismissed from the school. According to investigators, Sidney had become enraged over being kicked out of college and feared her mother would cut off financial support and force her to face consequences. As the call continued, university staff reportedly heard screaming, gurgling, and sudden silence before the line went dead. Sidney later fled the gruesome scene but was arrested shortly after. She was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison. In Florida in 1999, siblings 12-year-old Curtis Jones and 13-year-old Catherine Jones were arrested after murdering their father's girlfriend inside their home. Court records show the attack involved blunt force and stabbing and was carried out while the woman was asleep. Despite their ages, prosecutors charged both children as adults, placing them into the adult criminal justice system and exposing them to potentially decades in prison. At the time, the case was widely framed as an example of extreme juvenile violence. The siblings were jailed, processed through adult court, and publicly vilified. But years later, unsealed court documents revealed that the children had allegedly been subjected to repeated sexual abuse by the victim and had attempted to report it multiple times, but their claims were ignored. After those revelations, both sentences were reduced to single-digit prison terms. Following her release, Catherine Jones went on to dedicate her life to juvenile justice advocacy, speaking publicly about her case and working to reform how abused children are treated by the legal system. In 2012, Harold Henthorne claimed that his wife Toni had died in a hiking accident after falling 140 feet off a cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park. On the day of their 12th wedding anniversary, Harold insisted on a strenuous hike up Deer Mountain despite Toni's bad knee and limited hiking experience. After her fall, he gave investigators multiple conflicting accounts, repeatedly changing what he said he was doing at the moment she fell over the edge. Investigators later found a map in his car with the exact location of her death marked with an X and uncovered that his spouse before Toni had also died years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Toni's death closely resembled the 1995 death of Lynn Henthorne, who was crushed beneath a Jeep on a remote Colorado road when it supposedly slipped off a jack. Harold claimed both deaths were merely accidents, but prosecutors argued the similarities were far too extreme to be considered coincidence. In 2015, he was convicted of murdering Toni Henthorne and sentenced to life in prison. For years, rumors circulated that prostitutes who went to a pig farm outside of Vancouver never came back. That's because Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton was murdering them on his property. From the late 1980s to the early 2000s, dozens disappeared after being lured there, where they were killed, dismembered, and fed to the pigs. DNA from multiple victims was later found scattered across the farm, and in 2007, Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life, though prosecutors argued he killed at least 26 women. According to court records and police testimony, Pickton told an undercover police officer posing as a cellmate that he had killed 49 women and was upset he was caught right before making it to 50. Benjamin Guggenheim was a wealthy American industrialist traveling aboard the Titanic in 1912. As the ship sank, he refused a lifeboat, insisting that women and children go first. He reportedly changed into evening clothes with his valet and prepared to die on board the ship. Before disappearing below deck, Guggenheim is said to have asked a survivor to tell his family that he, quote, played the game straight to the end and that no woman or child was left behind because Ben Guggenheim was a coward. His body was never recovered. Jack Black's teenage years were marked by addiction long before fame entered his life. After his parents divorced, he began stealing money from his mom to buy cocaine at just 14 years old, spiraling into substance abuse while still practically a child. The addiction took hold during a period of instability and isolation, but he later thanked a non-judgmental school therapist with helping to pull him back from it. Jack ultimately got sober as a teenager, avoided relapsing as his career took off, and has spoken openly about how early intervention likely saved his life. In 1986, a Yakuza member attempting to smuggle a live hand grenade onto a flight from Manila to Osaka nearly took down the whole plane by accident. While hiding in the airport bathroom, the grenade's safety pin came loose, and in a moment of panic, the man abandoned it and fled back to his seat. Seconds later, the grenade exploded inside the aircraft, blasting a hole in the fuselage and resulting in rapid decompression. The explosion injured 109 passengers, but the plane somehow remained airborne long enough to make an emergency landing, narrowly avoiding what could have been one of the deadliest aviation attacks of the decade. Investigators later revealed that the man wasn't immediately arrested because he'd been badly injured in the blast. When the explosion ruptured a hydraulic line, hot oil sprayed all over his body, leaving him with severe burns that required immediate hospitalization before he was taken into custody. Eddie Murphy's childhood was shaped by sudden violence long before he became famous. When he was about 7 years old, his biological father, Charles Edward Murphy, was shot and killed during a domestic dispute involving his girlfriend. The killing abruptly removed his father from his life, leaving Murphy and his brother to grow up without him. The loss is rarely mentioned in discussions of his personal life, and Murphy himself has rarely addressed it publicly. In 2025, 35-year-old Michael Virgil died on board a Royal Caribbean cruise after allegedly being served more than 30 alcoholic drinks in a single day, according to a wrongful death lawsuit filed by his family. Court filings state that Virgil showed clear signs of severe intoxication before experiencing a violent outburst, during which he became disoriented and aggressive. Crew members restrained him as his condition worsened, and he later collapsed. Virgil was eventually pronounced dead on board, and his body was stored in the ship's refrigerated morgue until the vessel returned to port. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner later ruled his death a homicide, citing acute alcohol intoxication and restraint-related factors, and his family is seeking accountability from the cruise line for alleged over-serving and failures in response. Noah Schnapp has opened up about the psychological toll of playing Will Byers, a character subjected to prolonged fear, possession, and isolation starting when Schnapp was just 11 years old. He said that repeatedly filming scenes of terror and helplessness made it difficult to separate himself emotionally from the character, particularly during the earlier seasons when he was still developing emotionally. He later acknowledged that much of his early work required him to access fear and distress far beyond what most children experience at that age. But let's be honest, the real morbid fact here is that bowl cut. My God, they did him dirty. Caleb McLaughlin and Pryor Ferguson have both stated that becoming famous as children on Stranger Things exposed them to racist harassment from fans. They've said some of the harassment even escalated to messages threatening violence, including death threats, even when they were still just children. Maya Hawke has said her childhood unfolded under the shadow of a very public family collapse after her father, Ethan Hawke, had an affair with the family nanny, an event she's described as shattering her sense of stability. She grew up amid the fallout of that breakup, which she's linked to long-term anxiety and feelings of abandonment. As a child, Maya also struggled with severe dyslexia, falling so behind academically that she was eventually pulled out of school because she couldn't read at the expected level, leaving her isolated during years when structure and security were already unraveling. During a low-speed car crash in Georgia, what should have been a routine airbag deployment turned into a life-altering injury for Hannah Oliver. The collision occurred at roughly 25 miles per hour, but when the airbag deployed, it shattered the designer glasses she was wearing, driving fragments into her eye. Doctors later determined the damage was irreversible and Hannah went blind in that eye. But in the aftermath, she channeled the trauma into action, later launching a shatter-resistant sunglasses brand to prevent the same injury from happening to others. A young Arkansas couple pleaded guilty after attempting to sell their 2-month-old baby at a campground for $1,000 and a 6-pack of beer. The deal was written out in a handwritten contract and witnessed by others, one of whom alerted police. Authorities recovered the infant and charged the parents with child endangerment and attempting to accept compensation for adoption. The father was sentenced to prison time while the mother received probation, and both were permanently barred from contact with the child, who was placed in protective care. In December of 2025, 33-year-old Mexican-Canadian influencer Denise Gongora, known online as Mary Magdalene for her extreme cosmetic procedures and adult content, was found dead after falling from a 9th-floor high-rise in Phuket, Thailand. Just a few hours before her death, she shared this troubling post suggesting deep emotional exhaustion, prompting concern from fans. In the weeks leading up to the incident, videos circulated showing her appearing heavily intoxicated and being assisted back to her hotel by police and bystanders. Thai authorities reviewed security footage, witness statements, and scene evidence before officially concluding the case was a self-inflicted death. Carolina Olsen, later nicknamed the Sleeping Beauty of Sweden, went to bed at age 14 on a small Swedish island in 1876 and effectively stayed asleep for the next 32 years. For decades, she lay unresponsive, barely speaking, rarely moving, and depending on others to feed and care for her. When she finally awakened in 1908, she reportedly believed it was the same day she had fallen asleep. Although doctors later noted brief moments of awareness during those years, Olsen experienced no sense of time passing, essentially sleeping half her life away. Acclaimed filmmaker and actor Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner have been found dead in their Brentwood, Los Angeles home in what investigators are investigating as an apparent homicide. Emergency responders discovered the couple inside the residence during a medical aid call when their daughter Romy reportedly found them dead with their throats slit. Their 32-year-old son Nick Reiner was taken into custody and held on $4 million bail in connection with the deaths, though police have not publicly released a confirmed motive. Nick has a well-documented history of long-term drug addiction and periods of homelessness, first entering rehab around age 15 and struggling for years before finally getting clean. He later worked with his father on the 2015 film Being Charlie, which drew on his experiences with addiction and recovery. Rob Reiner was one of Hollywood's most recognizable directors and actors, known for films such as Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men. His death alongside his wife's has sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry as authorities continue their investigation. In December of 2001, 27-year-old Christian Longo murdered his entire family in Oregon as his web of lies, debt, and financial fraud began to unravel. He first strangled his wife, Mary Jane Longo, then turned on their children in the most sadistic way imaginable. 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie were bound to rocks and carried to Yaquina Bay, where Longo threw them into the freezing water while they were still alive, leaving them to drown in the dark. Their youngest child, 2-year-old Madison, was drowned alone in the family bathtub. Afterward, Longo abandoned the bodies, fled the country, and lived under a false identity in Mexico for weeks while his children lay undiscovered. At trial, he attempted to shift blame by falsely claiming Mary Jane had killed the children first, a story dismantled by forensic evidence and rejected by the jury. Longo was convicted and sentenced to death in 2003, and later resentenced to life without parole in 2011, where he remains imprisoned. In 2012, a homeless man named Ronald Papo was savagely attacked beneath a Miami overpass in an assault caught on camera lasting 18 minutes. The attacker, Rudy Eugene, beat him unconscious and chewed away most of his face, including an eyeball, leaving Papo permanently disfigured and blind. Police arrived during the attack and fatally shot Eugene when he ignored commands and continued biting his victim. Papo survived after extensive surgeries but was left permanently disfigured. Despite early claims of drug-induced madness, toxicology reports failed to identify any substance that could fully explain the horrific attack. In 2007, 2 teenagers from Ukraine began abusing animals and recording it on camera, torturing and mutilating stray dogs and cats, hanging them from trees, disemboweling them alive, and capturing their agonizing struggles so they could relive it later. Soon enough, this horrific routine would rapidly escalate into a full-on murder spree. Over just a few weeks in June and July, Igor Sopranyuk and Viktor Syanko killed at least 21 people at random, ambushing vulnerable strangers, elderly pedestrians, children, intoxicated individuals, and women. They bludgeoned victims repeatedly in the face with hammers and steel bars, smashing skulls until faces were pulverized beyond recognition, eyes gouged out while some were still alive, and bodies mutilated with screwdrivers stabbed into eye sockets and abdomens. Soon enough, the killings caused widespread panic in the region, with residents terrified to go out at night as bodies piled up in a brutal, motiveless rampage targeting the weak for fun. The pair was arrested in July of 2007 after police traced stolen cell phones pawned by the killers and matched witness descriptions and video evidence recovered from their phones and computers. In 2009, Soproniuk and Sayenko were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, while their driver and accomplice was sentenced to 9 years. The case, notorious for leaked footage like the infamous 3 Guys 1 Hammer video, showing the prolonged, merciless bludgeoning and stabbing of a cancer-weakened man, is now considered one of the most disturbing cases of filmed murders. In October of 2024, Micah Smith took his 3 young children, ages 2, 4, and 8, on a 9-mile hike in Utah that authorities described as extremely difficult and dangerous, especially as a major storm was rolling in. Court records say Smith failed to check the weather and continued climbing, even after sending photos of the incoming storm to his wife, who urged him to turn back. Investigators say he refused, later telling police he was comfortable hiking in the dark without lights. By the time they reached the summit around 6 p.m., hail and snow had started falling. The family began descending, but only made it about 600 feet before one child fell and struck their head. At that point, Smith decided to shelter in place overnight with the children, despite worsening weather and inadequate clothing. During the night, prosecutors say the children repeatedly said they were cold, exhausted, and wanted to go home. One child allegedly begged Smith to turn back earlier, saying she was afraid she might not survive, but he refused, calling the hike a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Court documents state Smith later claimed he performed CPR on his son overnight and instructed his daughter to continue the CPR before leaving his children behind. When search and rescue teams located Smith the next day, he was all alone and appeared completely unconcerned about his kids, telling responders he believed one of his children was already dead. A helicopter crew later found the 3 children together, severely hypothermic and inadequately clothed. All 3 children ultimately survived, though 2 were in critical condition, and one had a core body temperature of 63 degrees Fahrenheit that led to a stroke and emergency brain surgery. Smith was later charged with aggravated child abuse and child torture, with prosecutors requesting no bail, arguing he repeatedly chose to continue, despite warnings from the children, their mother, and the worsening weather. On June 5, 1986, 24-year-old New York City model Marla Hansen was asked by her landlord Stephen Roth to meet outside a Manhattan bar to collect an $850 security deposit he owed her. As they walked away, Hansen was ambushed by 2 men Roth had hired. One attacker restrained her head while the other slashed her face with razor blades, carving deep wounds across her cheeks as Roth stood by and watched. The attack required more than 150 stitches, leaving her with permanent disfigurement that effectively ended her modeling career. Hansen survived after extensive reconstructive surgery, and investigators later determined that Roth had ordered the attack after she rejected his romantic advances. He and the 2 attackers were convicted and sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Hansen said the trauma continued in court, where a defense attorney subjected her to a vicious and humiliating cross-examination, attacking her credibility, accusing her of manipulating men, and suggested she had falsely identified her attackers due to her being racist, an experience she described as worse than the physical attack itself. Real estate agent Todd Kohlhepp became known as the Amazon Review Killer after investigators uncovered sarcastic product reviews he had posted that referenced his real crimes. For years, he joked about using knives, chains, and shovels while remaining unidentified. In 2016, police traced the disappearance of Kayla Brown to his rural South Carolina property, where she was found alive, chained inside a shipping container after Kohlhepp had already murdered her boyfriend. A search of the land revealed multiple buried bodies, and Kohlhepp later confessed to killing 7 people between 2003 and 2016, including 4 victims in a Long Cold motorcycle shop massacre. Kim Stanger is a criminal law researcher in Ohio who lives with an extremely rare neurological condition that leaves her with no sense of touch, pain, or temperature. Her peripheral nerves don't transmit any sensory signals, meaning she cannot feel injuries, burns, or pressure on her body. Doctors have described her as the only living person documented with a complete loss of somatosensation at this level. As a result, Stanger must visually monitor her body at all times to avoid unknowingly injuring herself, as even severe wounds or extreme temperatures provide no physical warning. In 2004, 3-year-old Riley Fox was taken from her home while her mother was away at a breast cancer fundraiser. Her father, Kevin Fox, had spent the day with Riley and her 6-year-old brother making posters for their mom. That night, after bringing the children home from their grandmother's house, Kevin let them sleep on the couch because their bed sheets were still in the dryer. When Riley was discovered missing the next morning, Kevin initially believed she had wandered to a neighbor's house and searched the area with his son. But later that day, Riley's body was found several miles away near a park, confirming she'd been raped and killed. Investigators quickly fixated on Kevin, repeatedly questioning his young son and isolating Riley's mother while questioning Kevin for roughly 14 hours. He was shown horrific photos of his daughter's murder and eventually coerced into giving a false confession. DNA evidence later proved his innocence and he was released, but the ordeal had already taken its toll on Kevin's mental health. 6 years later, a woman tipped off the FBI about her former boyfriend, already imprisoned for crimes against a child, who had referenced Riley's case. His DNA eventually matched and he confessed, admitting he had entered the Fox home and killed Riley at a nearby park. Kevin Fox was fully exonerated and won a $9 million lawsuit against the state. The man responsible is now serving life in prison, and according to his confession, Riley's last words were, "I want my daddy." Comedy legend Artie Lange survived one of the most self-destructive spirals in modern celebrity. In January of 2010, after years of severe heroin addiction, he stabbed himself multiple times in the abdomen inside his Hoboken apartment, collapsing from internal bleeding and barely surviving emergency surgery. His addiction later led to overdoses, constant arrests, homelessness, and the collapse of his nasal septum as a result of long-term cocaine abuse, permanently disfiguring his face. Thankfully, in recent years, Lange has said he's sober, lives mostly out of the spotlight, and prioritizes stability and health over returning to fame. In 2007, Shelley Miscavige, the wife of Scientology leader David Miscavige, and once one of the organization's most powerful figures, attended her father's funeral and then completely vanished from public view. She's not been seen, photographed, or heard from publicly ever since. In 2013, actress and Scientology defector Leah Remini filed a missing persons report, prompting the LAPD to state they had located Shelley and confirmed she was alive and safe, though no evidence, images, or details were released, and no independent verification has ever occurred. Former Scientology members allege she was removed from leadership and confined to a secret church facility due to internal conflicts with David, claims which the organization vehemently denies, leaving her disappearance unresolved nearly 2 decades later. This was the moment a routine shoplifting stop inside a Walmart in Canton, Ohio nearly turned deadly. In December of 2025, body cam footage shows 2 suspects, Shane Newman and Katarina Jeffrey, being held in a small back office for questioning when the situation abruptly escalated. As Canton police officers apparently let their guard down, Newman reached into his clothing, pulled out a handgun, and attempted to fire it at an officer from close range. Luckily, the weapon malfunctioned and failed to discharge, a failure investigators say likely prevented a fatal shooting inside the store. The officer immediately moved to restrain Newman as additional officers rushed in to secure the room. Both suspects were taken into custody without anyone being physically injured. Police later confirmed Newman was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm and was also found to be in possession of hard drugs at the time of the arrest. He was charged with attempted murder, felonious assault on a police officer, robbery, drug possession, and having a weapon while under disability. His girlfriend was simply charged with complicity to commit robbery. This photo shows 15-year-old Preston Porter Jr. reading a Bible as he's led by rope toward his own execution by a lynch mob in Colorado in 1900. He'd been held and tortured for 4 days, beaten until he finally confessed to killing a white girl after police told him his father and brother would also be lynched if he didn't comply. Still a child, Preston was denied a trial and handed over to a crowd that had already decided his fate. He was tied to a stake and burned alive in public as excited spectators watched. Despite the coerced confession, his age, and the brutality involved, Preston was never posthumously exonerated. No official apology was issued, no conviction was overturned, and no one was held accountable. This was the moment influencer Clavicular was live streaming from Miami when a known stream sniper jumped onto the hood of his Cybertruck, filming and taunting him while refusing to move. Viewers alleged the man had been following and harassing Clavicular in the weeks beforehand and is a known stalker in the industry. Clavicular then accelerated and ran the man over as his passengers panicked and asked if the man had just been killed, as Clavicular responded hopefully.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Is he dead?
I don't know.
Hopefully.
Clavicular, a polarizing looks-maxing influencer known for content focused on facial structure, body aesthetics, and the belief that men can change their face through disciplined posture and extreme cosmetic procedures, went in for questioning, but no criminal charges were publicly announced. Some argue Clav acted in self-defense or out of fear against a reckless stalker, while others say running him over crossed an irreversible line, turning harassment into a near-fatal event. Clavicular has since been banned from Kick and described the situation as unfortunate without providing any further information. Tanya Catch was 14 when she was groomed and abducted in 1996 by Thomas Hose, a 38-year-old security guard at her Pennsylvania middle school. Struggling with family turmoil after her parents' divorce, she was lured to his home where he confined her for nearly a decade. For the first 4 years, she was locked in his upstairs bedroom, hidden from Hose's parents and son downstairs, using a bucket as a toilet. Hose subjected her to repeated sexual assaults while forcing her to document the encounters in a journal in a positive light. He brainwashed her, threatening to kill her and her family if she ever tried to escape. Around 2000, he gave her the false identity Nikki Allen and introduced her as his girlfriend, allowing limited outings with strict curfews. In 2006, while working at a local convenience store, Tanya confided in the owner Tony Sparico, who alerted authorities, leading to her rescue. Hose pleaded guilty to several charges, including involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, statutory sexual assault, and corruption of a minor, but not kidnapping due to laws of the early 2000s. He only received a 15-year sentence and was released in February of 2022. Hose remains a registered sex offender and reportedly returned to live just minutes from Tanya. She's since shared her harrowing story in her memoir, interviews, and media adaptations to raise awareness about grooming and abuse. On December 11, 2002, 22-year-old Alan Menzies murdered his best friend, 21-year-old Thomas McKendrick, inside his home in West Lothian, Scotland. Menzies had become obsessed with the film Queen of the Damned, watching it more than 100 times, and later told police he believed the character Queen Akasha was visiting him and instructing him to kill for immortality. When McKendrick came over that morning, Menzies attacked him with knives and a hammer, claiming the violence was triggered after McKendrick insulted Akasha. After killing him, Menzies drank McKendrick's blood and ate part of his head, stating this was the necessary process to become a vampire. He then placed the body of his best friend in a wheelbarrow and buried it in a shallow grave, where it remained undiscovered for the next 6 weeks. In court, prosecutors revealed Menzies had a long history of serious violence starting at age 14, including multiple stabbings. He literally told the court, "If you don't murder somebody, you can't become a vampire." Menzies received a life sentence with at least 18 years before parole eligibility, but in 2004, less than 2 years after the murder, he was found dead in his prison cell. DJ Carey, a former Irish hurling legend, was jailed after admitting he spent years faking a cancer diagnosis to scam friends and contacts out of nearly £350,000. Prosecutors revealed he sent staged photos showing what appeared to be medical tubing in his nose, later exposed as an iPhone charging cable taped to his face. He claimed the money was urgently needed for treatment, exploiting sympathy and trust while continuing the deception. The scheme collapsed when victims grew suspicious, and authorities confirmed he never even had cancer at all. Carey pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges and was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison. A man once spent nearly 5 months locked inside Rikers Island without realizing he could have walked free at any point for just $2. Court records later showed a judge had ordered his release only a week after he was arrested for a nonviolent offense, setting an absurdly low bail, but his lawyer never told him. With no one informing him of his status, he remained trapped inside one of the most notoriously violent jail complexes in the United States, a place long plagued by assaults, gang activity, neglect, and inmate murders. By the time the mistake had been discovered, months of his life had already been lost to one of the most dangerous detention systems in the country. On November 13, 1982, Duck Koo Kim fought Ray Mancini for the WBA lightweight title in Las Vegas. In the 14th round, Kim was knocked down hard and the fight was stopped. Minutes later, he collapsed from a massive brain hemorrhage, fell into a coma, and died 4 days later at age 27. Then, just a couple months later, in early 1983, Kim's mother died by suicide after traveling to the US and struggling with her son's death. Just a few months after that, referee Richard Green also took his own life after reportedly falling into severe depression, overwhelmed by guilt and public blame for not stopping the fight sooner. The bout became one of the darkest moments in boxing history and directly led to major safety reforms and the elimination of 15-round title fights. In 1977, unemployed Indiana man Tony Karitzis kidnapped mortgage banker Richard Hall after blaming him for the foreclosure of his home. Tony strapped a sawed-off shotgun to Richard's neck, rigged with a dead man trigger so any sudden movement could fire it, and held him hostage inside the Meridian Mortgage Company for nearly 3 days. During the standoff, Richard was forced to walk outside in public and even stand through a live press conference with the gun still pressed against his neck. With negotiations failing and Richard's life constantly at risk, police ended the siege by shooting Tony through a window, killing him instantly as Richard survived unharmed. This was the moment an American tourist realized she was in serious danger. While riding the Rail Runner mountain coaster in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, two adult black bears stepped almost directly onto the track in front of her. The coaster cannot be steered, stopped, or exited, leaving her a sitting duck as the bears stared her down from just a few feet away. But she was extremely lucky the bears showed curiosity rather than aggression, a common response when black bears don't feel threatened or have become accustomed to human activity. Wildlife officials later warned the situation could have turned fatal in seconds if the bears had reacted differently. Here's a video of a man playing with a blue-ringed octopus, completely oblivious that he's handling one of the most lethal animals on the planet. The tiny octopus contains tetrodotoxin, a venom powerful enough to kill an adult human within minutes, causing total paralysis while leaving the victim fully conscious and aware of what's happening. A single bite can shut down the lungs, stopping breathing as the body becomes unable to move or cry for help. There's no antidote, and survival depends entirely on immediate artificial ventilation until the toxin wears off. Even worse, blue-ringed octopuses often bite painlessly, meaning the man wouldn't even realize he's been bitten until his muscles begin to fail. On Christmas Eve in 2008, 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo arrived at his ex-wife's house in California wearing a Santa Claus suit and carrying multiple firearms. When the front door was opened by an 8-year-old girl, he shot her in the face before opening fire at a crowded family Christmas party. Bruce then unleashed a homemade fuel dispensing device hidden inside a wrapped present, igniting a massive fire that trapped victims inside as the house burned. 9 people were killed, some by gunfire, and others burned so badly that it took investigators several days to identify them. The fire burned so intensely that parts of Bruce's Santa suit melted onto his skin, forcing him to flee while still on fire. He later drove to his brother's house, where he turned the gun on himself. Investigators later determined the attack was driven by rage over a recent divorce, mounting financial pressure after losing his job, and a bitter custody dispute, with Bruce specifically targeting his ex-wife and her family. Police discovered that he'd spent months preparing, stockpiling weapons, booby-trapping vehicles with explosives, and compiling a list of additional targets, including his ex-wife's divorce attorney, making the attack one of the most disturbing holiday massacres in U.S. history. This was the horrifying moment a young child was nearly killed by her bus driver when she became trapped after her backpack was caught in the closing door of a Kentucky school bus as she was getting off. The driver then pulled away without noticing, dragging the child alongside the moving bus for hundreds of feet. Luckily, honking bystanders eventually caught the bus driver's attention and she was forced to come to an abrupt stop. The girl suffered serious physical injuries including nerve damage, requiring nearly a dozen surgeries and skin grafts, along with lasting psychological trauma. Court filings noted that she was a special needs student and argued that the bus route, supervision, and safety procedures in place were not appropriate for her needs. The bus driver was removed from duty and later fired, and the school district acknowledged failures in safety oversight. Years later, the child, publicly identified as Allie Rednauer, is back on her feet but continues to deal with ongoing physical and emotional effects and continued medical care. The case ultimately ended with a nearly $5 million settlement, and Allie and her family have since spoken out, pushing for mandatory school bus safety upgrades and warning that without changes, another child could be seriously injured or killed in the same way. Before fame, Shania Twain was already carrying adult burdens as a child, singing in bars until 1 a.m. at the age of 8 just to help keep her family afloat. But in 1987, that fragile stability was suddenly destroyed when her mother and stepfather were killed in a violent car accident after their vehicle was struck head-on by a truck driven by a drunk driver. Shania was only 22 when she became the legal guardian of her 4 younger siblings, putting her music career on hold to raise them and keep the family together, stepping into survival mode years before the world ever knew her name. Christopher Tapp spent more than 20 years in prison for the 1996 murder of 18-year-old Angie Dodge, a crime he didn't commit. Police had coerced a false confession out of him, even though none of the DNA at the scene matched. In 2019, genetic genealogy finally identified the real killer, leading to Tapp's full exoneration and a record-breaking $11.7 million settlement he received in 2022. But less than a year after finally reclaiming his life, Tapp was found beaten and unresponsive in a Las Vegas hotel room after an altercation. The coroner ruled his death a homicide, and a former pro wrestler was later charged. Here's a photo of Magda Goebbels with her 6 children, taken sometime before all 6 would be murdered by their own parents as Nazi Germany collapsed. Their father, Joseph Goebbels, wasn't just a high-ranking Nazi, but the architect of the regime's propaganda machine, a man responsible for saturating Germany with anti-Semitic hatred, glorifying mass murder, justifying the Holocaust, and convincing millions that extermination and total war were moral duties. He publicly called for the annihilation of Jews, celebrated civilian deaths, and demanded Germans to fight to extinction rather than surrender, even as cities burned and children starved. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin in May of 1945, Goebbels remained fanatically loyal to Hitler, retreating with his family into the Führer bunker. There, Magda decided that her children could not live in a world without Nazism, poisoning each of them with cyanide as they slept. Afterward, Joseph and Magda reportedly took their own lives as Berlin fell and the Third Reich collapsed around them. This was the moment when a woman's dark past finally caught up with her after 4 decades.
How you doing, Miss Sharon? Pretty good.
Uh-oh, they're coming for you, Sharon! They don't want me. They want Reggie. What's up?
Well, we're here for you, ma'am. Definitely here for you.
Ma'am, we're not.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're okay.
I'm so sorry.
Go ahead and go home.
In 1983, Deborah Newton, aka Sharon, vanished with her 3-year-old daughter Michelle, telling the child's father she was taking her to Georgia and never returning. Michelle was raised under a false name, never told she was a missing child, and never told her biological father spent decades believing his little girl was gone forever. For years, Deborah was listed on the FBI's most wanted parental kidnapping list, hunted on paper while she quietly rebuilt her life. But the case eventually went cold as Michelle's name was removed from national databases and the trail went dark. Deborah remarried, lived as Sharon in Florida, and even her husband had no idea he was married to a fugitive who had erased a child's identity. Then, more than 40 years later, officers approached her as she was walking her dog in the neighborhood and arrested her, exposing the dark secret she had lived inside of for most of her adult life. She now faces a custodial interference charge in Kentucky, a crime with no statute of limitations, while the daughter she kidnapped learned that her entire life was built on a lie, and that her father had been searching and waiting for her all along. This was the moment the gaming world lost an all-time legend. On December 21st, 2025, Vince Zampella, the 55-year-old co-founder of Respawn Entertainment and Infinity Ward, and one of the most influential figures in modern video games, died in a violent single-car accident on Angeles Crest Highway, a notoriously windy mountain road north of Los Angeles. Driving a 2026 Ferrari 296 GTS, the car veered off the scenic roadway just after exiting a tunnel, slammed into a concrete barrier, and erupted into flames, trapping Zampella in the burning wreckage as he was pronounced dead at the scene. A passenger was also ejected from the vehicle and later died at the hospital, their identity not yet released. The California Highway Patrol said the vehicle left the roadway for unknown reasons, and authorities have not yet disclosed whether speed, mechanical failure, or other factors played a role. Zampella's death comes just days before Christmas, shocking the gaming world and leaving his 3 children and ex-wife grieving, while studios across the industry are mourning the loss of a creative force whose work shaped franchises like Call of Duty, Titanfall, Apex Legends, and Battlefield. John Cena holds the all-time record for the most Make-A-Wish visits by far, personally granting over 650 wishes for children with life-threatening illnesses. Many of these visits have taken place in intensive care units or hospice settings, oftentimes with children who would pass away weeks or even days later. Hospital staff have said Cena routinely stays far longer than scheduled, sitting with families after cameras are gone, letting kids talk about fear, death, or unfinished dreams while he stayed fully in character as their hero. He's never publicized these encounters himself and refuses to use them for branding, saying he sees them as his life's purpose rather than for charity. Cena has also privately supported veterans suffering from severe PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, including meeting wounded soldiers who believed their lives were over due to permanent disabilities. Several veterans later said those conversations with the wrestling legend single-handedly saved their life. Cena has consistently avoided receiving any public credit for these interactions. This was the moment when a routine day on the slope suddenly spiraled into chaos, when a chairlift at Georgia's Godori Ski Resort malfunctioned and began racing backward down the mountain. The lift reversed at high speed, smashing chairs together at the bottom terminal and violently throwing riders to the ground, while others were forced to jump to avoid being crushed by swinging metal seats. Screams erupted as people piled at the base of the lift, with some narrowly missing being struck by flying chairs and bodies. At least 8 people were seriously injured, including tourists from several countries, with reported injuries ranging from broken limbs to head and spinal trauma. Investigators later concluded the rollback was triggered by an electrical failure, which was only worsened by operator error after emergency procedures were not properly followed. In the aftermath, the lift operator was suspended and resort managers were forced to resign. Criminal and civil investigations later followed, examining how a system designed to keep riders safe turned into a death trap within seconds. Here's some insane footage of a domestic cat that's reached an astounding age of 29 years, the rough human equivalent of someone in their late 130s. Most house cats live 12 to 15 years, and even reaching 20 is rare. Cats that make it this far are often born with unusually resistant genetics that slow age-related organ failure, especially in the kidneys and heart, and that advantage is typically reinforced by consistent care in a low-stress environment. A doorbell cam caught this bird appearing to float in midair because the camera's frame rate synced perfectly with its wings. Each time the camera captured a frame, the bird's wings were in the exact same position, creating the illusion that it was suspended motionless above the driveway. In January of 2020, Storm Gloria completely battered the coast of Spain, whipping seawater rich in organic material into massive clouds of sea foam. Powerful winds blew the foam inland, piling it waist-high through the streets and swallowing storefronts, cars, and people. The surreal scenes were a side effect of a storm that also caused deadly flooding, widespread destruction, and multiple fatalities across the country.